Welcome to Tax Teach. Today I'm going to talk about what happens when you don't file your tax return by the due date, your Form 1040 individual tax return. This year the due date was April 15th, and that is a pretty usual due date for individual tax returns. If April 15th is on a holiday or a weekend, the deadline gets pushed to the next business day, but this year the tax due date was April 15th. For those of you that completed your tax return by the due date, congrats to you. Another tax season in the books. This video is for those of you who haven't had the chance to file your tax return by April 15th, so your tax return right now is late. I'm going to talk about what you need to consider when you have a late tax return, what kind of penalties you should expect from the IRS. So let's get into it. When you are filing a late tax return, you're either expecting to receive a refund from the IRS, right? Or you're gonna end up owing taxes to the IRS. If you're expecting to receive a refund, you're in a different scenario than if you are someone who's expecting to owe taxes to the IRS. The reason being is the IRS calculates penalties on a late filed return based on the taxes that you owe the IRS. And when you're in a refund position, you don't owe any taxes to the IRS owes you a refund. In that case, I would, if I were you, try to file your tax return as soon as possible so you can get that refund as quick as possible and use it for whatever you seem deemed fit. Now, if you're on the other camp, right, if you are someone who thinks that they will owe taxes, there's a little bit more thought you have to go through and considerations you need to consider, which I'll go over now. If you are filing your tax return late and haven't paid your taxes yet or expect to owe additional taxes to the IRS, there are two common penalties that the IRS will assess. The first one is failure to file your tax return on time. The tax return was due April 15th, and if you file it past that due date without an extension, you're going to get hit with a failure to file penalty. And that penalty is 5% of the unpaid tax for every month that you have not filed your tax return. This penalty can get as high as 25%. So that's if you are someone who is filing your tax return late, try to get that done as soon as possible, because every month that you have it outstanding, you're accruing penalties on that, as well as interest. The IRS will assess interest on top of your penalties. So try to get your tax return filed as soon as possible, because you're accruing that 5% every month on your unpaid taxes. The second penalty that the IRS will assess is failure to pay taxes. If you filed your tax return late and you haven't paid the taxes that you owe, the IRS is going to assess 0.5% every month that you have not paid your taxes. So it's 0.5% of the unpaid taxes up to 25%. It's worth noting that both these penalties are separate. Let's say April 15th comes around, you're like, oh shoot, or April 16th comes around, you're like, oh shoot, I forgot to file my tax return, but I know how much money I think I'm going to owe the IRS. You could send a payment to the IRS, an estimate payment, and you could stop the penalties for accruing for your failure to file, right? Because you sent the money, you're estimating how much taxes that you owe, and that might stop that penalty if you give them a decent estimate. Your failure to file penalty will keep going until you file your tax return. But if you have an estimate of how much you think you're going to owe in taxes, you could send that to the IRS to stop that failure to pay penalty. Now, the only way, like I mentioned, the only way you can stop your failure to file penalty is to file your tax return, so try to get that done as soon as possible. Both penalties I just mentioned are assuming that the tax return is not fraudulent. If you're acting in bad faith, you're trying to avoid taxes in an unethical manner, the penalties can go a lot higher than 25%. I assume most of you are in good faith. You're just trying to get your tax return done with the information you have. And under those facts and circumstances, like I said, 25% max for your failure to file in combination with, your failure to pay penalty. Again, the failure to file penalty is accruing at 5% of your unpaid tax every month, up to 25%. And then your failure to pay is 0.5% every month of your unpaid taxes. And in both scenarios, you will accrue interest. The IRS realizes that there might be some circumstances that limit the taxpayer's ability to file their tax return on time. If you meet certain, extraordinary circumstances, for example, natural disaster, maybe an immediate family member passed away, or you didn't get all the information that you needed on time due to it's not your fault, it's somebody else who didn't provide you that information, you can attach a reasonable cause statement or letter to your tax return, explain to the IRS like, hey, this was out of my hands, I tried to get that tax return done, but there's just things I couldn't control where I was not able to get the tax return done by April 15th this year. The IRS will look at this letter and determine if if that meets reasonable cause, and they may waive your penalties and interest depending on if they think your reasoning is reasonable. To prevent this kind of thing from filing your tax return late next year, I would consider trying to file an extension before the due date. An extension is Form 4868. It gives you another 6 months to file your tax return, so you don't have to worry about that failure to file penalty until October 15th this year, if you would have applied the Form 4868 extension on your Form 1040. Keep in mind that this does extend your time to file your tax return, but it does not extend your time to pay. April 15th, you need to pay most of your taxes on the April 15th due date. Most, or if not all, your taxes. Just know that next year, if you want to avoid that failure to file penalty, consider filing an extension by that tax return due date. To conclude the video, if you're filing your tax return late and you are a taxpayer that is expecting to receive a refund, you're in a pretty good spot because the chance of you owing penalties is minimal, because the IRS assesses penalties based on the amount of taxes that you owe the IRS. And I would encourage you to try to get your tax return done as soon as possible so you can receive that refund and spend it on whatever you want. On the other side of things, if you're a taxpayer that's filing your tax return late and you're expecting to pay the IRS additional taxes or pay them taxes, I would consider maybe talking to a CPA or a tax professional just to help you out during this time. It could be nerve-wracking dealing with IRS letters, on penalties and interest that you owe. And it might be a good idea to reach out to a CPA or a tax professional to help you through those times. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next video.